North Korea is a closed-off country and the center of debate among international organizations. Its nuclear program and militarist displays have faced condemnation by most of the world. This relates to discussion of civilian human rights violations in North Korea. A United Nations report from 2014 concluded that their gravity and extent has no parallel in the contemporary world. This is pretty damning stuff, and it's a shame that the North Korean government is so unapologetic about it. What they are embarrassed about, though, are these human rights violations. North Korea's economy is incredibly strange. According to estimates, their nominal gross domestic product is 25 billion USD, and their purchasing power parity GDP is 40 billion USD. This is an incredibly hard figure to calculate because of the lack of reliable economic data for the country. It's estimated North Korea could make between $100 million to $200,000 in sales by mining Bitcoin. What this estimate does mean, though, is that there may be a new way to skirt sanctions. The North Korea's business is entirely transactional and has a smaller economy than Beverly Hills LA. Of course, they don't trade in designer handbags or rodents. Instead, they funnel a large fraction of their income back into the military. Our nation has had a lot of opportunities, but it has also lost its power in the economy. This leads to ignorance and misunderstanding of the depth of our disappointment. The Korean War ended in 1953 after a number of years of conflict and devastation between the new ideologies shaping 20th century politics. After the Korean War, the Korean Peninsula was back where it started and divided along the 38th parallel, with a capitalist nation in South Korea and a communist nation in North Korea. North Korea was able to make an extremely strong start after that. With support from their communist neighbors, China and the Soviet Union, North Korea was able to bounce back and start building at a pretty impressive rate, quickly pulling ahead of their similarly named neighbor to the south. The North Korean government is a planned command economy, which means that all of the production, investment, and allocation decisions on resources are determined by the government. This is very similar to China and Soviet Union, the Allies. In a centrally planned economy, the top bodies of government come together to make plans for 5 years. The Supreme People's Assembly would offer their input that would then be turned into a final, legally binding plan by converting it to a law. These plans will first target construction of ports and increases in crop yields. North Korea was in a pretty rough spot economically in the early years after the Korean War. It's had to focus on trade just to build itself back up, and it has been able to trade natural resources with its communist partner China. They would provide North Korea with technical goods and industrial know-how to convert the country from a fledgling agricultural nation into an industrialized powerhouse. This all started to slow down, though, in the mid-60s, when North Korea was under immense pressure by China. The goal was to make North Korea more industrialized by raising the living standards of the population by 2020. Now, for the first time, it seems like North Korea will not be able to achieve this ambitious 7-year plan. North Korea aligned more with China. They were all communist, and they were all friends. It was hard to choose which parent you liked more since they were both great. But the North Koreans kind of saw themselves as being a bit better because they had to have their act together. Given the pressures of capitalist nations, like the United States, who were going to stop the global spread of communism at all costs in the 1960s, it was the right time for communist ideology to thrive. And despite all of the advantages, it wasn't until South Korea's RNG was getting bigger at a faster pace than North Korea. Eventually, this problem with slow growth turned into an economic crisis in the late 70s. North Korea has been deeply in debt for a long time. They could still raise some funds through government borrowing and had ambitious plans that would have worked if the country was not already struggling. It would have been great if North Korea had invested the money that was taken from our agency into the development of infrastructure. According to a study we saw, they spend 25% of their budget on military spending. The US, which spends a ridiculous amount, actually puts only 5.4% in its military. If you look past the seemingly low North Korea spending, there are 2 things to keep in mind. 1. The United States also has state budgets. There are quite a few aspects to the local or state government, covering everything from police officers' well-being to school education. These governments make up close to 50% of total US government spending. So the actual military expenditure is not as severe as it sounds, realistically making up just under 30% of total government spending overall. North Korea does not have a state budget. It has provinces, but the whole economy works off a central national budget, meaning that 25% figure in the 70s was the whole story. The other bigger consideration here is that the US is not a centrally planned economy, and federal government spending only accounts for about 9% of the USA's total output. This means that in 2018, the US only had a military expenditure of 3.2% of its total GDP. In North Korea, a centrally planned economy, the government's budget kind of is the economy. And so in this period, military expenditure was around 20% of their total economy. All of this economic mismanagement and reckless military spending meant that in 1980, North Korea defaulted on its debts, which cut off its ability to borrow money to keep its head above water. As if that wasn't enough, there was a huge drought happening in the region at the time of these economic difficulties, and it meant that its neighbor to the south was easily able to surpass it economically without any problems. These things have helped lead them to who they are today. North Korea struggled its way through the rest of the 80s, relying heavily on China and the Soviet Union to feed its people and keep its infrastructure afloat. These countries were actually happy to help out for more of North Korea's natural resources, which they traded for in return. They also wanted to prove communism was the future and central planning was definitely legitimate. If North Korea's already had a rough go of it, it got even worse in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And this meant that North Korea lost its biggest benefactor. But North Korea managed to pull through, and in 1993 announced another 3-year plan for economic development. This time, a 3-year plan was started focusing on agriculture, light industry, and foreign trade. It all sounded great. But, just like all the plans in the past, this one didn't work out. There were 2 major issues. First of all, North Korea's trade agreements weren't going as well because they were now under a crippling famine. In addition to that problem, fertilizer became scarce and had to be imported from other countries, while supply was also limited internally due to trade sanctions. Another reason for the failure of North Korea was its inability to produce enough goods to trade with other parts of the world, which exacerbated the problem with their investment in infrastructure building, which was useless because they didn't have access to factories or equipment. And they were not able to import machinery because of the lack of anybody that wanted to do business with them. Though difficult, trade is an inevitable need for any small economy like North Korea, and it is something they can't do without. A lack of trade means their economic situation will only get worse. This makes North Korea want to try anything to improve their economic prospects, even if it meant resorting to the thing that it hated the most in a desperate attempt to modernize its economy. North Korea was considering private enterprise, but it was doing so in a very traditional way. From 2009 to 2013, experimentation in small-scale entrepreneurship took place, and although there were some legal uncertainties, this area had developed massively by 2016. Economic liberalization has been heavily implemented, and the state is seeing returns of up to 50% of profits per product. Raw materials are up for sale at market-based prices that are on par with a typical free market. In 2014, the Enterprise Act was amended to allow state-owned enterprise managers to engage in foreign trade and joint ventures and to accept investments from non-government domestic sources. Under the new rules, enterprise directors became more akin to Western chief executive officers and chief engineers. If you enjoyed today's video and would like to see similar videos, click on this video to the right, or maybe this video to the left might be more interesting to you. Hope to see you all in the next video. Take care, and remember, stay informed, stay prepared.